What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Haunted Beard. My name is Jake. Today, I want to talk about a newer film from 2022 that just came out last month called Watcher. It was directed by Chloe Okuno, who directed my favorite segment from the VHS 94 film. Let's talk about it. So, Watcher tells the story of a young American woman who moves with her husband to Bucharest and begins to suspect that a stranger who watches her from the apartment building across the street may be a local serial killer decapitating young women. Real quick though, this review will have some spoilers in it. I'm going to talk about those towards the end of the review, and I'll give you an official warning when I'm getting ready to mention them, but just wanted to give you a heads up. First thing I want to talk about is the cinematography. This movie is very nice to look at. A lot of the interior shots have just kind of a nice warm glow to them. A lot of the exterior shots have just a cold feel, kind of a grayish blue tint to it almost. And a lot of just like the colors of the movie, there's kind of like a very pastel type color palette in this movie. Some like soft pinks and oranges and blues and greens. And overall, it's just a really pretty movie to look at. And from a visual perspective, I thought it was one of the highlights of the film. Next up, I want to talk about Maika Monroe's performance, who is our lead character of Julia. And so she moves to Bucharest with her husband, and immediately you get this sensation that she is kind of this fish out of water. She doesn't speak the language. She's in this foreign place that she's unfamiliar with. And so for the most part, she does a pretty good job of just kind of conveying those feelings and emotions of just feeling uncomfortable and not at ease. And then the fear and the paranoia and the anxiety start setting in when she starts thinking that there's a stalker across the street watching her. And so she's just a very fragile, anxious person, very emotional, and is just scared. And so for the most part, I think she conveys all that pretty well. I do wish, though, that we would have gotten a little bit more out of her character just in terms of like getting to know who she is. I feel like there's not a whole lot of depth there. We don't really learn a whole much about her and who she is. And so I think the performance is pretty good, but I just wish that maybe, I guess, the writing in terms of her character would have been a little bit more there. I wish there would have been a little bit more depth and complexity to her character. Now, the aspect of this movie that I think is going to be a make it or break it for the vast majority of people is just in its presentation and the overall pacing and how it presents and tells the story. And really, this is just a slow burn. There is a lot of scenes that seemingly have very little consequence, that don't kind of move the story forward very much. And so I think for a certain percentage of the audience, that's going to kind of turn them off and they're going to get a little bit bored with it. However, I think that that's kind of the point. I appreciated the more minimal, kind of restrained, and I think a more realistic approach to this type of story and this type of scenario, that there are a handful of scenes that are just kind of not a whole lot happens. It's just sort of this typical routine everyday sort of events that we're seeing. But again, I think that's kind of the point. The movie does a pretty good job, I think, of not getting too over the top, too Hollywoodized, if you will, and really kind of gives us a very, I think, more authentic and realistic portrayal of what this type of scenario, how it might actually play out if it was really happening to somebody. And so I appreciated that type of approach. And so there's a little bit there. It kind of took me maybe a little bit to settle in to where I kind of was like, okay, I kind of see this is sort of the vibe they're going for. And so for the most part, I kind of got on board with it. And I enjoyed the slower pacing, just more realistic approach that the film takes. Now, in terms of the suspense scenes that we get along the way throughout the film, I think there's a handful of pretty good ones. And particularly, there's a scene at a movie theater and then in a grocery store that I think works pretty well. And it's just kind of this slow build as the fear just continually grows inside Julia, and the anxiety and the paranoia just kind of, builds and builds until, the pot kind of boils over, sort of thing. But there's also later on a dream sequence that, for the most part, I feel like dream sequences are overused and they're kind of just used for a cheap scare. And in a way that kind of applies here too. However, it actually kind of got me. I jumped. And so I'll give it some props for that. It actually got me. So There are a handful of pretty good suspense sequences throughout this movie that just really kind of help contribute to that overall vibe of paranoia and anxiety. And overall, I think the film does a pretty good job of creating this element of doubt. And is Julia really being stalked, or is she just being paranoid and overreacting? And there's a particular scene involving her and her husband where she asks him not to think about this, to stop rationalizing it. And so it always gives this reason how it presents these scary, suspenseful scenes. There's always kind of a rational explanation that we as the audience could just be like, oh, she's just being paranoid. And I like that they brought that up in a scene between her and her husband. I also want to mention real quickly the score. I think overall the score does pretty well. It's nothing too over the top. It's kind of a low, kind of brooding score. I also like how much they really didn't use it and just kind of went with a more quiet, silent approach in these suspenseful scenes. That is typically more effective for me personally, and so I think the use of the score and when they didn't use the score was pretty effective as well. Okay, so now I want to get into spoilers. So if you want to avoid spoilers, click on the timestamp in the video to avoid spoilers, but this is your official warning. Okay, so my main issue with this movie, unfortunately, is how they handled the ending, and I thought the ending was pretty disappointing. There is a point in the movie that at about 40 minutes in where Julia is having drinks with her next door neighbor, and her next door neighbor shows her a gun. And I actually paused the film and wrote this down in my notes. I'm going to read it to you right now. Prediction. At the end of the movie, she is going to find herself in her neighbor's apartment. She's going to remember there's a gun in the drawer, and that's what she's going to use to kill the bad guy. 40 minutes into the movie, I wrote this. And unfortunately, that's pretty much exactly what happens. And so I feel like they had an opportunity to really do something different with the ending, but they just kind of went the traditional, generic, formulaic route. And when it got to the end, and she finally figures out that the guy really is the killer, and he slashes her throat, and she's going for the drawer, and I'm like, okay, here's what's going to happen. And then she stops, and it looks like she bleeds out on the floor. And he's laying right next to her. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, they went there. They go the dark route. They kill the main girl. I'm like, okay, yeah. And then they don't. And it is just like, it was such a disappointment. Because like that whole sort of trope of a person you think is dead and out of the picture comes up at the last second with a gun or out of nowhere or unexpected and shoots the bad guy. And it's just like, how many times we've seen that so many times before. And it's like you just had this opportunity to really kind of stick the landing of the movie and have this thing stand out. But you played it safe and just went with the typical traditional route. Also, too, there is a scene where she goes into a club and meets her neighbor there and is talking to her neighbor about the stalker. And the neighbor mentions maybe never finding out would be the best conclusion if he really is the killer or not. Or wouldn't that be better than you being killed and your last thought going through your mind was, I was right? And I thought either one of those endings would have been pretty great, or at least something different than the ending that we got. And unfortunately, the ending that we got, as I've said, is just pretty disappointing for me. So overall, this is kind of a tricky one to grade, I feel like, because for the majority of the film, I had a pretty good time with it, and I was on board. I liked the slow burn, slower pacing, more realistic approach. I do think that there's a handful of pretty good suspenseful scenes. However, the movie doesn't stick the landing for me, and the ending is pretty disappointing. And so, because of how they end the film, I feel like it really affects the overall film. And how can it not? And by the way that they choose to end the film, it really just kind of becomes a pretty standard, generic sort of paranoid thriller. And so, at the end of the day, I think my overall grade for this is I'm probably going to be at like a 5.5, maybe a 6 out of 10, somewhere right in there for my overall grade for Watcher. So, those are my thoughts. Once again, thank you so much for watching. If you have seen this thing, let me know your opinions down in the comments. Would love to hear from you. What did you think of it? What did you think of the ending? Did you love it? Were you disappointed? Let me know down in the comments. I want to hear from you guys. Also, too, hit that red subscribe button. If you like horror and thriller movie content, that's what I do on The Haunted Beard. Again, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time on The Haunted Beard.